We are currently witnessing a masterclass in tactical brilliance that is quietly masquerading as strategic suicide. Right now, the United States military is executing one of the most suffocating, technologically overwhelming naval blockades in modern geopolitical history. The operation is utterly flawless. The metrics of suppression are staggering. And yet, it is precisely because this maximum pressure campaign is so flawlessly executing its immediate tactical objectives that Washington is inadvertently accelerating the collapse of the very global financial and security order it is desperately attempting to protect. We are looking at a classic geopolitical paradox, where a superpower wins every single engagement on the board, only to realize the opponent has fundamentally changed the rules of the game while the pieces were moving. To understand the sheer scale of the strangulation currently being applied to the Persian Gulf, we must strip away the sanitized language of diplomacy and look at the brutal, kinetic reality on the water. For over a month, United States Central Command has enforced an absolute maritime tourniquet across Iranian ports. In the past several weeks, the enforcement has escalated to a point of near-total economic asphyxiation. We are not talking about simple tariffs or diplomatic censure. We are looking at the hard physical redirection of nearly 100 massive commercial vessels and the aggressive disabling of several others that attempted to run the gauntlet. The financial hemorrhage caused by this naval wall is currently assessed at $500 million every single day. Let us pause and translate that sterile $500 million daily metric into the oxygen-deprived reality on the ground. A sovereign economy losing $500 million every 24 hours is not merely experiencing a recession. It is undergoing a violent, structural disintegration. Picture the vast, industrial outskirts of Bandar Abbas. For a generation, the commercial docks here were a chaotic, deafening symphony of global maritime trade. Today, the massive steel cranes stand paralyzed against the sky, like the bleached ribs of a rotting carcass. The silence in these ports is physically heavy. In the sprawling, smog-choked neighborhoods surrounding these dead industrial zones, the macroeconomic data bleeds directly into the living rooms of the working class. Because of the hyperinflationary shockwaves triggered by this blockade, the price of basic subsidized bread and cooking oil is effectively severing families from their own survival. The electricity grid, starved of the critical replacement parts, now held up by secondary maritime sanctions, flickers and dies for hours at a time in the suffocating heat. In the darkness of a cramped, sweltering apartment, a retired civil servant must now make the agonizing choice between buying imported, black-market asthma medication for her grandchild or purchasing enough low-grade rice to keep the family fed for the week. That is what a maximum pressure campaign actually looks like in the shadows. It is not fought in the polished halls of the United Nations in Geneva or New York. It is fought in the empty refrigerators and terrified calculations of millions of civilians who have become entirely expendable collateral in a great power shadow war. And when a state's underlying survival is threatened by this level of external pressure, the internal fist invariably clenches. The regime knows it is fighting for its absolute life, and paranoia becomes the official language of governance. In just the past few days, Iranian internal security apparatuses have swept up over 6,500 individuals for public dissent. 6,500 students, shopkeepers, and ordinary citizens swallowed by the dark void of the state security apparatus, their lives destroyed because a besieged government can no longer afford even the illusion of domestic criticism. The streets of Tehran and Isfahan are gripped by a terrifying, watchful silence, where neighbors measure their words and the shadow of the secret police falls across every whispered conversations. Contrast this visceral, bleeding civilian despair with the cold, mechanical overmatch hovering just offshore. Central Command has recently released operational imagery that looks as though it were ripped directly from a dystopian defense contractor's promotional reel. United States Marine Corps AH-1Z Viper attack helicopters are currently conducting aggressive, low-altitude patrols, physically shadowing commercial tankers through the narrow choke point of the Strait of Hormuz. These are not mere observation craft. They are hyper-lethal flying weapons platforms, bristling with AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles and AGM-179 joint air-to-ground missiles. They represent a looming, metallic promise of immediate and overwhelming violence against any vessel that deviates from the dictated maritime corridors. But the real shadow falling over the Iranian plateau is being cast from thousands of miles away, across the European continent. Positioned at Royal Air Force Fairford, the United States has deployed a dozen B-1B Lancer bombers. This is not a standard rotational deployment. This represents potentially more than half of the entire mission-capable fleet of the United States Air Force's heavy supersonic bombers. They are conducting ramped-up, continuous sorties that originate from the American Midwest, relying on an intricate, highly vulnerable global ballet of aerial refueling tankers to keep them aloft for 37-hour round-trip missions. We must understand the psychological terror engineered into this specific airframe. Each one of these Lancers can carry 74,000 pounds of ordnance. Let the sheer physics of that payload sink in, 74,000 pounds of kinetic devastation. And in a terrifying escalation of capability, these bombers are now actively integrating reinstated external pylons designed specifically to carry hypersonic glide vehicles and long-range anti-ship missiles. When you equip a supersonic bomber with a stealthy anti-ship missile that possesses a 600 nautical mile range, you fundamentally rewrite the geometry of naval warfare. It means an American pilot can loiter comfortably in international airspace, well outside the protective envelope of Iran's coastal defense cruise missiles and air defense batteries, and systematically vaporize maritime targets or deep-buried command bunkers without ever crossing into contested territory. It is the ultimate projection of untouchable imperial power. On the surface, the tactical results of this overwhelming force posture are undeniable. According to recent congressional testimonies from the highest levels of the United States Navy, the Iranian defense industrial base has been catastrophically degraded by up to 90%. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' infamous fast attack boats, which historically swarmed the Strait of Hormuz in packs of 40, have vanished into the coastal inlets. Now, you are lucky to see 2 or 3 heavily monitored vessels per transit. The supreme leader has not been seen in public for nearly 3 months. Operating from an undisclosed, heavily fortified bunker, he is reduced to firing off defiant declarations on social media, framing this existential moment as the third sacred defense. By every conventional military metric, Washington has successfully pushed Tehran to the absolute brink of total systemic collapse. Here at World Horizon View, however, we do not simply read the Pentagon press releases or swallow the sterile victory narratives broadcast by mainstream defense analysts. We track the deep, structural tectonic shifts grinding beneath the noise of the daily headlines. And the shift happening right now beneath the waters of the Persian Gulf is profound, and it is largely going unignored by the architects of this very policy. We must ruthlessly analyze who is actually benefiting from this escalation, because it is certainly not the American public, nor the broader stability of the Middle East. The primary immediate beneficiaries of this crisis are the entrenched segments of the American military-industrial complex. For the defense contractors manufacturing the long-range anti-ship missiles and engineering the external hypersonic pylons for the B-1B fleet, this blockade is not a geopolitical crisis. It is a highly lucrative, real-world testing ground. They are utilizing a volatile theater of war to accelerate the deployment, integration, and live environment validation of next-generation munitions that will guarantee billions in future procurement contracts. Simultaneously, the current administration in Washington is aggressively harvesting massive amounts of domestic political capital, projecting an aura of uncompromising strength and deterrence, signaling to a polarized electorate. Meanwhile, the energy producers in the Gulf and select speculative actors in the global oil markets are quietly reaping vast fortunes from the constrained Iranian export revenues and the heightened price volatility that shadows every helicopter patrol in the Strait. The real costs, the devastating externalities of this grand strategy, are being entirely outsourced. They fall squarely on the broken backs of the Iranian civilian population, bleeding out through that $500 million daily financial tourniquet. They are paid in the blood and terror of the 6,500 citizens swept into the regime's dungeons. And the secondary risks are being absorbed by regional allies and the international commercial shipping industry, who are forced to navigate a heavily militarized choke point without reaping any commensurate strategic upside from the American pressure campaign. But the most fatal miscalculation lies in the core strategic objective itself. The stated surface motive of this entire operation is maximum pressure to violently compel Tehran back to the negotiating table to force an absolute capitulation on their nuclear program. Yet, just days ago, the Iranian chief nuclear negotiator publicly and unequivocally declared that the fundamental structure of Iran's nuclear program, specifically its uranium enrichment capability, is absolutely non-negotiable under any circumstances. Enriched uranium will remain on sovereign Iranian soil. Why would a nation staring down the barrel of total economic annihilation and overwhelming military overmatch draw such a suicidal red line? Because the American maximum pressure campaign has fundamentally validated the most paranoid, hardline factions within the Iranian deep state. The sustained economic strangulation and the constant threat of kinetic decapitation are poised to catalyze the exact opposite of what Washington intended. By completely cutting Iran off from the Western financial architecture and demonstrating the terrifying vulnerability of relying on globalized supply chains, the United States is actively accelerating Tehran's pursuit of absolute technological self-reliance. They are forcing the regime to view full, indigenous weaponization and unconstrained uranium enrichment not merely as a bargaining chip, but as the only logical biological imperative for state survival. If conventional defense is impossible against a B-1B bomber carrying hypersonic munitions, the only rational deterrent left is the nuclear threshold. Furthermore, this asphyxiation is permanently driving Iran out of its historical geopolitical isolation and directly into the waiting arms of the emerging Eastern Bloc. Look at the desolate, moonscape terrain along the border of Sistan and Baluchistan. In the dead of night, amidst the swirling dust and the threat of drone strikes, a massive, illicit shadow economy is thriving. Thousands of heavily modified pickup trucks, driven by desperate young men earning barely $20 a night, are running sanctioned crude oil and fuel out across the porous borders. But the truly terrifying element is what those same trucks are smuggling back in. It is no longer just black market consumer goods or basic medicine. It is advanced dual-use optical sensors from Shenzhen. It is military-grade microchips. It is the vital componentry for next-generation suicide drones. The American blockade is violently severing Iran from the Western economic hemisphere, only to seamlessly graft it onto the Chinese shadow supply chain. Beijing is watching this American masterclass in economic warfare with intense, calculating interest. They are studying exactly how the United States weaponizes the global financial system, how it leverages the dominance of the dollar to dictate the sovereignty of a mid-sized regional power. And in response, China is quietly, methodically building the alternative architecture. By pushing Iran to the point where it has nothing left to lose, Washington is creating a fearless test subject for a post-dollar global economy. Tehran is pioneering complex, non-dollar barter systems, digital currency evasion tactics, and dark fleet logistics that bypass the traditional sanctions architecture entirely. Every single day this blockade continues, the petrodollar system bleeds out a little more of its unipolar authority. The very sanctions architecture that has historically propped up American financial hegemony is being eroded by the sheer, blunt force overuse of its power. We are witnessing the inadvertent, accelerated fragmentation of the post-Bretton Woods order. The United States is utilizing 20th century financial weapons and 21st century aerospace superiority to win a tactical standoff in the Strait of Hormuz, but in doing so, it is actively writing the blueprint for its own global obsolescence. They are forcing a critical mass of sanctioned and non-aligned nations to realize that existing within the Western financial system is a fatal vulnerability. Here at World Horizon View, the ultimate question we must ask is not whether the blockade will successfully bankrupt the Iranian state. It already is. The question is what rises from the ashes of that bankruptcy. When the smoke clears and the daily metric of destruction is complete, Washington will be forced to confront a reality where its military overmatch remains unquestioned, but its structural power to dictate global behavior has evaporated. We are left staring at a terrifying binary abyss. Will the United States double down on this kinetic asphyxiation, risking a catastrophic, multi-front regional war simply to maintain the illusion of control over a non-compliant state? Or will Washington recognize that its addiction to the maximalist weaponization of its own currency is exactly what is driving the permanent fracturing of the global world order? This is the razor's edge of modern hegemony. Do you shatter the global system to win the immediate battle, or do you concede a tactical failure to preserve the empire? Let us know which side of history you believe we are witnessing in the comments below. The architecture of the next century is being forged in the dark waters of the Persian Gulf right now, and the cost of misunderstanding this moment will be absolute.